an attendee in listen-only mode.
Very course of rampaging through the Capitol, threatening the lives and security of members of Congress, and preventing the constitutionally ordained process of counting electoral votes. The company also blocked Mr. Trump from posting on Facebook or Instagram for 24 hours. The next day, January 7th, Facebook extended the restriction on Mr. Trump's posting privileges, and I quote, "indefinitely and at least the next 2 weeks until the peaceful transition of power is complete." Now, rather than make a concrete decision at the end of that 2-week period, Facebook left the indefinite suspension in place. And on January 21st, it referred the entire matter to the Oversight Board, apparently hoping that the board would do what it had not done, namely decide on an appropriate and proportionate conclusion regarding the future of Mr. Trump's account. It is that decision to impose and leave in place an indefinite suspension that the board was called upon to review. Our decision this morning is relatively simple and straightforward. First, we agree that Facebook had sufficient justification to remove Mr. Trump's January 6th posts for violation of the policy against praising or encouraging violent actors. Second, we agree that Facebook had sufficient justification to suspend Mr. Trump's account, at least for the duration of what the Department of Homeland Security called a, quote, heightened risk of violence. But we hold that it was improper, that is to say, in violation of Facebook's own rules, as well as generally accepted principles of freedom of expression, for Facebook to make that suspension indefinite. Let me quote the key holding from the opinion. It is not permissible for Facebook to keep a user off the platform for an undefined period with no criteria for when or whether the account will be restored. The opinion, which I hope that you will read carefully and in full, stresses that Facebook's own policies do not authorize an indefinite suspension. In the event of a violation, a user's post may be removed or restricted with no future limitation, with a limitation for a specific time-bound period, or even, in severe cases, permanently. But users and their audiences must not be left in a state of uncertainty as to time or reasons for restoration. Moreover, principles of freedom of expression recognized internationally and also in the United States maintain that restrictions on speech must be clearly stated and understandable. Indefinite penalties of this sort do not pass the international or American smell test for clarity, consistency, and transparency. That is the Oversight Board's sole responsibility. We are not cops ranging over the realm of social media and solving the world's ills. Our sole job is to hold this extremely powerful corporation, Facebook, accountable for making clear, consistent, and transparent decisions, showing neither fear nor favor toward persons of political influence. The board is holding today that Facebook's treatment of Mr. Trump's future posting privileges did not meet these standards and cannot continue without a sober and comprehensive review, applying the same rules to Mr. Trump, neither better nor worse, as applied to everyone else. We are giving Facebook 6 months to conduct this review, at which point the company must make a definite and clear determination based on the severity of the conduct and the danger of future harm. It must either restore Mr. Trump's account, finding that the period of suspension has met its purpose, make the suspension permanent, or suspend the account for a determinate period of time. Our decision does not prejudge the outcome of that process. That is not our job. Facebook must make its decision and be held accountable for whatever it decides. Ultimately, it is the public that will be the judge. That is as it should be in a democratic society. Over to you, Helen.
Thanks very much, Michael. Well, as you can hear, in this case, we did not have an easy answer, and our deliberations revealed the enormous complexity of the issues that were involved. Our decision is quite detailed, and as Michael, I want to encourage everyone to actually go and read it in full. And before I talk about our policy recommendations for Facebook, I just want to add a few points to some of what Michael said. First, the decision made by the board does not restore Mr. Trump's access to Facebook and Instagram. What the board has done is that the board has given Facebook a clear direction. Make a decision in the next 6 months that is actually consistent with your own rules and reflects the seriousness of the violations that took place and the prospect of future harm. This means that Facebook should either permanently disable Trump's account or impose a suspension for a specific period of time. If Facebook opts to impose a new suspension before they can lift it, they must carefully assess whether restoring Mr. Trump's access is likely to lead to harm. And if it is, the board has told Facebook they should impose another suspension. Mr. Trump should not automatically get back onto Facebook and Instagram. The second thing is that Facebook's decision to impose an indefinite suspension that wasn't supported by their own rules and then to request the Oversight Board to endorse this move was actually wrong. The board's role is to ensure that Facebook's rules and processes are consistent with its content policies, its values, and respects human rights. In applying an indeterminate and standardless penalty and then referring the case to the board to resolve, Facebook actually shirked its responsibilities. And the board insists that Facebook apply and justify a clear penalty. This case also raises broader questions about Facebook's impact on the events of January 6 and its impact on democracies around the world. And this informed the board's policy recommendation to Facebook, and I'll quickly run through our key recommendations. First, Facebook's rules should ensure that when it imposes a suspension for a specific time period on an influential user, the company should assess the risk of inciting harm before the suspension ends. Influential users who pose a risk of harm should not be reinstated. Second, Facebook should publish a new policy which would govern its response to crisis situations. This should set limits on Facebook's discretion, including a requirement to review its decision within a fixed time. Third, restrictions on speech are often imposed by powerful state actors against dissenting voices and members of political oppositions. Facebook must resist pressure from governments to silence their political opposition and stand up for free expression. When assessing risks, Facebook should be particularly careful to consider the political context and rely on staff who understand the local context and are protected from political and economic interference. Fourth, when Facebook implements special procedures that apply to influential users, these should be well documented. In this process, the board heard many concerns about the potential application of the so-called newsworthiness allowance. Facebook has told us that it did not apply this allowance in this case and has never applied this to content on Mr. Trump and Trump's Facebook and Instagram accounts. But it is important, however, that Facebook addresses this lack of transparency and the confusion that it has caused. And this means that Facebook should clearly explain how the newsworthiness allowance applies to influential accounts, including political leaders. The board also wants to stress to Facebook that considerations of newsworthiness should never take priority over urgent action to prevent harm. Fifth, Facebook should explain its strikes and penalties process, giving users more information, including how many strikes have been assessed against them, because users don't know this by now. Six, in the future, if a head of state of government or high government official repeatedly posts messages that pose a risk of harm, Facebook should either suspend the account for a definitive period of time or delete the account. Seventh, Facebook should publish a full report on its potential contribution to the narrative of electoral fraud and the political tension that led to the events of January 6th. When Facebook's platforms has been abused by influencers users in a way that results in serious human rights impact, it should conduct a thorough investigation to discover what role it played and what change it could help prevent future situations like this. The review needs to be a detailed and transparent look at the design and policy choices that Facebook made that enable its platform to be abused, and we strongly encourage the company to do this. So those were the 7 recommendations. The recommendations that we have announced today build on a pattern of recommendations we have issued to Facebook in other cases this year, which have called out shortcomings in Facebook's content policies and called for far greater transparency from the company. And lastly, I want to say that the decision made by the Oversight Board today illustrate, in my view, exactly why independent oversight matters. Anyone who is concerned about Facebook's excessive concentration of power should welcome the Oversight Board clearly telling Facebook that they cannot invent new unwritten rules when it suits them. The board's purpose is to shift Facebook from an arbitrary approach to content moderation to one where Facebook's rules are clear, transparent, and treat all users fairly. This is important not just for users in the United States, but users all over the world, including the countless political leaders, campaigners, and dissidents around the world who depend on Facebook to engage with communities. And with that, I'll turn it over to Thomas to speak a little bit about the board's process in this case.
Thank you, Hannah. So the process used to review and decide this case was the same that applies in all cases before the Oversight Board. Following Facebook's referral of the case on January 21st and the board's acceptance of the case, it was deliberated by a panel of 5 board members. This panel was randomly selected, but also structured to include representation from the United States and a mix of gender representation as well. After the panel reached a decision, its findings were reviewed and approved by the board. Decisions must be approved by a majority of members in order for them to proceed to be published. This meant every board member was involved in the decision, but it does not mean that every member necessarily agrees with everything that is said in the decision. The decision in this case was reached by consensus on the panel, although you will note, of course, that the decision contains a number of minority opinions, which you can read in the text. I want to note that panelists considered an unprecedented number of public comments when deliberating the case. These came from individuals and organizations around the world, and the board would like to thank everyone who took the time to submit their valuable and varied perspectives. The decision announced today by the board is binding on Facebook, and the company has 7 days to implement the board's findings. Facebook must also consider our policy recommendations and has 30 days to respond publicly to those. The board will be scrutinizing how Facebook responds, and we are in the process of setting up a working group that will provide additional resources to track Facebook's implementation of our case decisions and the recommendations. We'll also be sharing further insights on Facebook's responses as part of our regular transparency reporting, and I look forward to sharing an update on that soon as well. And with that, I'll pass back to Dex.
Thanks, Thomas. We will now open the line for questions. Please limit yourself to 1 question per person. To ask a question, click the hand icon on the dashboard, or if you've dialed in, press star followed by the number 1. And we're just waiting to receive questions through the system. Our first question is from Julia Borstein at CNBC. Julia?
Hi, good morning. Thank you for doing this. I'm just hoping you could give some clarity about the 6-month period, when that period is up and what it is exactly that Facebook has to do by the end of that 6-month period. Just to sort of wrap up where you're pushing some of this responsibility back on Facebook and what is on them now, especially in the next 6 months.
Great, and I'm going to pass that question to Michael.
Yes, thank you for the question. Facebook has up to 6 months to reconsider this matter, and the period of time should indicate, that we expect this to be a deliberative process. Should not be a rushed and hurried decision. It ought to be one made fully on the basis of all the considerations and evidence. Also, one of the reasons for the length of time is we expect that Facebook will consider our policy recommendations very carefully. We, of course, cannot require Facebook to follow any of those, but we are confident that they will take them seriously, and many of them should be reflected in the Facebook's rules by the time Facebook then considers the actual Trump account case again, and so that way the company can apply clearer, more consistent rules to this case rather than operating in a kind of ad hoc and retroactive fashion. But at the end of the 6 months, we expect Facebook simply to reach a new decision, and it is up to Facebook what it does at that point. Now, that decision may be again appealed or referred to the board, so we may speak to it again, but in the first instance, Facebook will decide, and it may very well make Mr. Trump's suspension permanent, or it could decide that this period of time has been sufficient and that circumstances have changed and he no longer presents the kind of danger that was true on January 6th and 7th, or they can also impose a definite time-limited additional suspension. Those are the three consequences that are provided for this kind of violation in Facebook's rules, and those rules apply to Mr. Trump no better or worse than they apply to any other user.
Thanks, Michael. Our next question is from Yamich Al-Sindoor with PBS NewsHour.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Hi, thanks so much for taking my question. It sounds like you're saying Facebook, and it's very clear you're saying Facebook needs to make this decision, but the company did lean on the board to say you need to make this decision. So I wonder if you could just talk through, is this you basically pushing the decision back onto the company, and what do you say to any criticism that might come of that, given the fact that the company really wanted to try to get an independent board to make this decision for them?
I'm going to pass that question to Hella.
I don't think we're just passing the buck back to Facebook here, because the board has made a clear decision. Facebook initial suspension of President Trump was correct. That's very clear. But also we're saying that an indefinite ban was not acceptable. And the reason why that is not acceptable is because Facebook actually failed to follow its own rules on removing harmful content by choosing an indefinite suspension. And that's why the board has decided that Facebook has to go back, and within the next 6 months, Facebook must review the suspension and choose a penalty which is actually contained in its own rules. And I like to point out that this is perhaps more a decision that concerns Facebook and its users rather than Trump, because what we are basically saying is that it can't be left up to Facebook to just choose their own penalty for users. They have to follow their own rules. If users have to follow the community standards and the values of Facebook and Instagram, Facebook has to do the same. So we're basically saying that all users are equal and that Facebook also has obligation towards the community standards, and that is to follow their own rules.
Thanks, Hella. Our next question is from Katie Notopoulos at BuzzFeed.
Hi, can you hear me? This is Katie from BuzzFeed. I'm wondering what you guys think is the likelihood that 6 months from now you'll see this same case back on your docket, either way, which decision Facebook makes about this.
I'll pass that question to Michael.
I'd say it's certainly a substantial possibility, but if Facebook follows our recommendations and does what we are hoping to do, this time the decision will be deliberate. It will be in accordance with Facebook's rules. It will be clearly explained. It will be on the basis of actual findings about severity of the conduct and the possibility of likelihood of future harm. And at that point, our expectation and hope is that it will be a much easier matter because Facebook will have done what it should have done the first time.
Thanks, Michael. Next question is from Mike Isaac, New York Times.
Hey there. Thanks so much for taking my question. I guess I just wanted to know if it's fair to say, I mean, it basically seems that y'all are saying that Facebook has kind of been making up the rules as it goes along, and I want to know if that's a fair characterization, and what's just sort of what sort of, I don't know, policy levers are there to prevent them from doing so in another 6 months from now, or if they've committed to sort of cementing their rules in order from stopping a kind of improv every time a very high profile user goes to this sort of length. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Hella?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, we are kind of saying that. We are saying that it is, the Oversight Board is clearly telling Facebook that they can't just invent new unwritten rules when it suits them. And for special users, they have to have a transparent way of doing this. And that's why it might be that Facebook comes back to us with this. But I would suggest that if they follow our recommendations and have more transparency and clarify their own rules, also this notion of newsworthiness, then it should be possible for Facebook to look at this case again, find out whether this user, Mr. Trump, is still in a position where he can cause harm on Facebook, and then find out what is the suitable penalty. And that's what we are suggesting. Implement our recommendations, and then it should be easier in another case, in the similar case or in another case like this, to actually get the ruling right from the beginning. And what we are saying is that they did get it right, but they can't have a penalty which is indeterminate because that's not in their own rules.
Michael?
Yes, and I'd like to, your characterization is, I think, entirely correct from my understanding of the decision, but I want to emphasize that this is not the only case in which Facebook has engaged in ad hocery. As we see so many, we've gotten over 20,000, I believe it is, appeals from users who are frustrated at not knowing what the rules were, not knowing why Facebook that it took a kind of bewildering mess. And I believe that the very existence of an independent oversight board it's designed to change the culture of content moderation on the platform. When Facebook knows that there is someone looking over their shoulder and insisting upon clarity, transparency, consistency, fairness, then I think that it is much more likely that we'll be seeing some internal reform, because I hope and really expect that this sort and this is not the only one. But this sort of decision will change the culture of content moderation at Facebook, not just for Mr. Trump, but for users high and low.
Thanks, Michael. Next question is from Rory Kellan-Jones, BBC.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. On your website, you say the Oversight Board was created to help Facebook answer some of the most difficult questions around freedom of expression online. Do you think, following today's ruling, they will feel helped, or they will feel that you've actually let them down? And do you think their commitment to maintaining or even expanding your role will be lessened after today?
Hella?
Yeah, thanks. I think they will appreciate this decision, because it is actually very clear. And I think anyone who reads, and I really encourage again people to read it. It's long, but it's not that long. It is clear they were right to take down this content and block Mr. Trump from putting stuff on his accounts. But they should not have given a penalty that wasn't in their own rules. And we're telling Facebook, go back and be more transparent how you view these things, assess Mr. Trump again from the new ways of doing it that we are suggesting, and make sure that you don't give an arbitrary penalty, and make sure you treat all users the same. I think that is really good and strong guidance to Facebook. And if I sat on the Facebook side, which I don't, I would know more or less what to do now, because it is pretty clear what we're suggesting. So I don't think they regret it. I think they're very happy that they send it to us. But what we are saying is that they, in a way, shirk their own responsibility by sending it to us without looking into their own sanction system and following their own sanction system.
Thanks, Hella. Next question is from Robert Schmidt, Newsmax.
Robert, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Hey guys, sorry about that. Thanks for taking the question. Do you guys believe that Facebook acts in any way in a partisan manner?
Thanks, Robert. Question for Michael.
Oh, that's a very good question. The problem is when you do not have clarity, consistency, and transparency, there's no way to know. And certainly many people in the United States and around the world strongly suspect that Facebook is behaving in a partisan manner. Now, almost everybody thinks it's behaving in a partisan manner in favor of the side. So, you know, there's not real clarity about what it's doing. You know, I personally have no way to know, and much of the reason for demanding, you know, consistency and transparency is so that this can be revealed. I think procedural regularity is often the best guarantee against subliminal or implicit bias.
Great, thanks, Michael. Next question from Casey Newton with Platformer. Casey, you need to unmute.
Hi, sorry about that. I thought I would go rogue and be the first person not to say, can you hear me? Anyways, my question was about the review that you are requesting of whether Facebook's design contributed to the Capitol attacks. I wanted to know, is that something that you are arguing should be made public? And if so, specifically, what aspects of the platform are you asking Facebook to investigate?
Thanks, Casey. Hella?
Yes. Yes, we are asking Facebook to publish a full report on its own potential contribution to the narrative of electoral fraud, first of all, which we're running up to the January decision, and the political tension that led to the events of 6th of January. And the reason why we're asking that is that Facebook has been clearly abused by influential users to incite or to instigate harm. And that is why we think it's appropriate that Facebook looks into themselves and asks if they have any responsibility that this could occur and that harm happened. So it's only right that Facebook should look at itself and publish a report on this.
Thanks, Heather. Next question is from Liz Dwoskin, Washington Post.
Hey, Dax, thanks for doing this. So it sounds like the board is essentially, by saying that rules need to be applied equally to all users, is essentially recommending an end to the newsworthiness exception. Are there two questions? Are there cases in any scenario where you can envision that there should be considerations for newsworthiness? And also, more importantly, what criteria should Facebook use to assess a continued risk of violence? Should they try to put that right into their rules?
Thanks, Liz. Michael?
I do not read our recommendation as saying that the newsworthiness exception should be eliminated in all cases. Not at all, but rather that it must not take priority in emergency situations where political leaders are involved in speech that may lead to immediate violence and lawlessness and similar harm. I think that there is a place for a newsworthiness exception. I'm now speaking just for myself. This is not a recommendation from the board, but by analogy to American law, we, under the First Amendment, recognize that some speech that is on what the Supreme Court calls matters of public concern must be permitted, even if the same speech would be prescribable in a purely private context. And that makes a great deal of sense in light of the underlying values of freedom of expression.
Hella?
Yeah, just a few words on that, because I think the newsworthiness exemption is really interesting, particularly because when we asked Facebook whether they had applied in this case, as I said, they said that they had not implied or they had not used the newsworthiness in this case. And I think you can discuss whether they should have it or not, but what is important is that if Facebook has a newsworthiness part of their decision, they must make that transparent, because it's not transparent now. No one knows when and if newsworthiness is used. And what we are basically saying is that political leaders do not have a greater right to freedom of expression than other people. And we also concluded that newsworthiness will never be sufficient reason to keep up content from public figures that incites violence. So they can never trump inciting violence, but in any case, they need to be much clearer about when they apply the newsworthiness criteria.
Thanks, Hannah. Time for one last question from Jacob Heinel Jensen at BT.
Yes, thank you so much. If I may, can I direct this question for Mrs. Thorning-Smith? I would like to know that if the council is worried that if Mr. Trump cannot express himself on Facebook, if these expressions will move to other media outlets without the same control, and here I'm talking about underground media outlets on the internet. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think it's a question that we should be debating very publicly, and I guess that's why I personally have joined the Oversight Board, because I feel that we have a very big platform here that regulates content on Facebook and Instagram. And in many cases, that will be better, is much better that we have community standards, that Facebook should abide by the community standards, that Facebook has said they want to abide by human rights law. And I think it is much better to hold that company to account and do it via the Oversight Board. So yes, that's a philosophical discussion that you can have. And that is why I think it is so important to actually have the oversight board and make sure that the biggest platform we have here, Facebook and Instagram, that we have an oversight board that regulates the content and helps Facebook. So they should certainly not be alone in taking these decisions, and that's why it's important to have the oversight board. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Helen. And that's all the time we have for questions. Thanks everyone for joining today. If you have any additional